Ladies and gentlemen,
today's news talk.
News and information.
TNT Radio.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. We're in the second hour of this live broadcast. I'm your host, Patrick Henningsen. Thank you for rejoining us. And over to the United States, kind of an important story, and it is very emblematic of a sort of problem that we've been flagging up in Washington. We're looking at the encroachment of authoritarian powers, unconstitutional legislation, all of the things that, well, definitely we've seen members of the Republican Party fighting tooth and nail over the years to try to roll back the Freedom Caucus, of course, but somehow recently we've seen a joint bipartisan effort to extend a piece of legislation a lot of people are opposing. It has to do with FISA warrants and warrantless wiretapping. I want to welcome on to the program an American attorney, Gerard Filliti, Senior Counsel at the Lawfare Project, to talk about this important subject. Welcome to the program, Gerard.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, first of all, Gerard, I mean, this was something that received all kinds of attention over the last couple of years, namely for its role in the whole Crossfire Hurricane investigation. It's hugely controversial. A lot of Americans rejected this out of hand at the time, and a lot of people believed that this would be mothballed and literally sent out to pasture. But somehow new life has been breathed into this FISA bill. And can you explain to us exactly what it is and what powers does it give the federal agencies?
Well, when we're talking about what Congress reauthorized it for the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA, we're looking specifically at something called Section 702. Section 702 was designed to allow American law enforcement and intelligence agencies to collect information on non-Americans overseas. And that is a very valid thing. We want our intelligence agencies to be able to do that. We want the CIA to catch the next bin Laden and listen in on his conversations. The problem is that in surveilling foreigners, sometimes, perhaps often, you also capture the conversations that American citizens in the U.S. are having with people who are suspected of perhaps being bad actors overseas. And the real issue is whether the FBI and other agencies can access those records that include conversations that Americans have in the U.S. without a warrant. FISA, Section 702, says they don't need a warrant. They can just run a search. And this is where we have Crossfire Hurricane. This is where we had searches of Donald Trump's campaign staff in 2016. This is what the problem with FISA is, because the FBI has abused its powers and accessed that database impermissibly. So now when we're talking about renewal, the issue is under what circumstances, if at all.
And this is how I think Mike Flynn was snared with the Russian ambassador. They were surveilling him, Kislyak, I believe his name was. And Michael Flynn was incidental communications because he was in that orbit. But it's not just they can surveil one or two steps away from the target as well. There's ancillary connections that are included in that net. So it's not only the target, is it?
Correct. And that's exactly the problem, because Mike Flynn, once someone at the FBI or another intelligence agency sees his name in the conversation, then they just go into the database and see who else he's talking to. So then you're no longer talking about foreign intelligence, you're talking about domestic espionage on our own citizens. And again, that's where the problem is. So one of the things that was proposed, what Republicans in the Judiciary Committee, for example, were pushing for as a compromise, was to have a warrant requirement. If you want to look up the data for an American, you have to go to court and get a warrant. That's not what's in FISA now, and unfortunately, that's also not what was just passed by the House.
Yeah, I mean, it's already been proven that it can be abused. And if let's say the agency is politicized or actors within a federal agency are politicized, and we only have to look at the FBI agent, I believe his name was Kleinsmith, was implicated in, I believe, forging some part or faking some part of a FISA warrant in order to kind of get it through. And I don't know what happened to him, if he was really held accountable for that or not. But that would have been the real alarm that should have went off at that point. That's about the worst possible scenario you can have in a place like the FBI, is that level of abuse. And it looked like it was politically motivated. How dangerous is that when you're talking about campaigns, you're talking about election cycles? Is that not election interference?
Oh, that's very dangerous, and quite frankly, it's hard to trust the FBI after what we've seen them do for so many years now. Unfortunately, they used to be the preeminent law enforcement authority in America, but now they're in disrepute because there have been so many issues, so many legal violations, and no one has ever really faced consequences. They don't fire people, they don't reassign people, they don't send people to jail for breaking the law. They just bury it under the rug. And this has a terrific problem, the risk of being abused. Now, in the US, there's PIs, private investigators, used to make a living by having a friend at the DMV who would run a record for them. And now it's the FBI. Every politician has a friend at the FBI who run a record for them and do this warrantless illegal search, and nothing ever happens. So it's a very big risk. And this is why we need to cap how this program is used, if at all.
Now, a lot of people think, Gerard, and I'm not asking you to agree or disagree on this, but there are a lot of people who believe that there was political will to kill this particular piece of legislation, or at least not rubber stamp it or give it an extension. But then Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, was given a special intelligence briefing in a SCIF, a secure compartmentalized intelligence facility. And when he came out, he had this to say to the press. We've got this clip. I want to roll this. I want to get your reaction to this, Gerard, what you thought about this. Go ahead and roll this clip.
When I was a member of the judiciary, I saw all the abuses of the FBI, the terrible abuses over and over and over, the hundreds of thousands of abuses. And then when I became speaker, I went to the SCIF and got the confidential briefing from sort of the other perspective on that to understand the necessity of Section 702 of FISA and how important it is for national security. And it gave me a different perspective. So I encourage all the members to go to the classified briefing and hear all that and see it so they can evaluate the situation for themselves. And I think some opinions have changed both ways, but that's part of the process. You got to be fully informed.
Have you been
So right there, Gerard, it was that sort of, he's been shown the Jack Bauer ticking bomb scenario in the intelligence briefing and has had a Damascene conversion on Section 702 of the FISA bill. What's your reaction to that?
My reaction to that is I've been on both sides of this. So I do get that intelligence agencies need that flexibility. And we do live in a time when we just saw last weekend Iran shooting rockets all over the Middle East. And we do live in a time when we are under more risk than ever that we will be drawn into a foreign war. So we do need to know what's going on. Flip side is having a warrant requirement for when you're looking up secondary or tertiary information, that shouldn't be that hard of a stretch. Judges are fast on things like that. It's a little procedural step that guarantees our civil rights and doesn't really impede the investigative process. So I get what he's saying. I think that he does have a point of the need for 702. I agree with that. But you still need procedural safeguards. You still need to have a warrant. Otherwise, what's the point of our Constitution?
Yeah, I mean, you're making a nuanced point. You're basically saying, we understand the big ticket items, the big security threats, but then you're trying to separate that to protect the rights of ordinary Americans that, let's face it, there's no evidence that they're guilty of any crime per se. It's incidental communication. Certainly, they should be able to make that separation, to make that distinction. But in politics, we're seeing more and more of this, Gerard, this kind of polarization, all or nothing approach to pretty much everything, especially in the legislative theater. I know that politics is dividing Washington, but even on this particular issue, certainly that would have been a reasonable distinction, but yet it's not being made, and that's quite puzzling, or isn't it? What do you think?
I think that right now we see what's going on, the bigger picture domestically, if we will, the campaign between Joe Biden and Donald Trump and the tactics that are being used against Trump. And that is taking the oxygen out of rational thought on smaller, and I use air quotes here, smaller items like foreign intelligence acts. Because everything has become polarized from the top down, there isn't enough bandwidth to look into all of these aspects. Every day you're dealing with new attacks on democracy, lawfare against candidates, criminal trials that shouldn't be taking place, that when you get into the weeds, you don't have time for that. So I think that's part of the issue. Congress is distracted by other issues right now, and they just don't have the bandwidth to delve into this.
There are people that believe, Gerard, that once the executive branch or once central government basically gathers a certain amount of power, that they're very reluctant to relinquish that from government to government. And that's the sort of slow creep that a lot of people, like, say, the more constitutionally minded commentators and the Thomas Masseys of the world, that's the argument that they're making constantly. And that's the big concern, because it doesn't matter. Well, I don't think it matters who's in power from one administration to the next. Those are centralized authoritarian big government powers, and any government's going to want to use them.
Any government's going to want to use them, and it's a system that perpetuates itself, because we're talking not about a political entity or a politicization. We're talking about bureaucratization. You've developed an identity for these agencies where they just perpetuate the same beliefs. So you're hired, you share the belief of the person who hired you. You go up in rank, you stay there for 20 years, and you're more likely than not going to hire people who think just like you. So after a period of time, you have this groupthink at these agencies. And when this groupthink started under certain administrations, the lean is one way. It's authoritarian. It's more, we can do what we need to do to safeguard America, civil rights be damned. So I think it's a problem that the system perpetuates itself.
And we got a couple of minutes left, and I appreciate your time, Gerard, but there's another important issue. It's actually in the title of your organization. What we have seen in the last year is really enough to make your head spin, even by Central American Banana Republic standards. The lawfare that has been deployed against the GOP frontrunner is pretty unbelievable. I mean, it's kind of obvious they've lined all these cases up right during the election cycle. And this is ostensibly some of the same people that were screaming election interference for the last 8 years. And this is, to me, a great example of election interference, of election meddling, trying to keep the presumptive nominee of the Republican Party for president, off the ballot, or just knock him out of the race completely. This is unbelievable. I don't know. It's sunk in for a lot of people I know of this is historic, but I want to get your thoughts on this before we break, but go ahead.
This is historic to see this happening to the former president of the United States, who is more or less the front runner in the race to win the White House in November. We've seen the legal system being abused many times over the years. But look at New York City. You've got an act that was not illegal, paying money for a settlement, paying money to your lawyer for a settlement, and all of a sudden you're facing criminal charges for falsifying records. And you have to be in court 4 days a week. You can't go on the campaign trail. You can't do other things. You have to sit in that courtroom for months at a time, be completely distracted, pay millions of dollars to your lawyers, and still risk losing and ending up in jail or having other disqualifying offenses. That's lawfare. You silence someone by abusing the law to bring fraudulent charges or even just to harass them. And that's what we're seeing now in New York and in other jurisdictions targeting Donald Trump. And it's scary, because if the president of the United States, Donald Trump, a billionaire with all these assets, has to deal with it, how about the ordinary guy? How about you and me? What happens when that system is turned against us?
What do you think Donald Trump's prospects are in overcoming a lot of these obstacles? He's done very well so far to get this far. A lot of people are surprised he's gotten this far. What's your kind of assessment going forward in the next, before November? What do you think?
I think that he will continue to do well. I know that the conventional wisdom in New York is, it's everyone's Biden, he's not going to get a decent jury. I don't really agree with that, because New Yorkers are contrarians. That's my hometown, and we don't always do what's expected of us. And people like to think things through. And when you think, wait a second, there's no evidence for any of this, I don't think he's actually going to be found guilty. But it's still a waste of time and a waste of resources. And the other cases are equally ridiculous. So I think ultimately, whether it's through the Supreme Court, through appeals, or jurors doing the right thing, I think he's going to end up fine, but it's going to take time, and it's a massive distraction.
Yeah, this is really the strangest general election cycle of anybody's living memory. Everyone I've talked to in politics, they just can't believe this is going on. It doesn't feel like a general election with all of this happening. But listen, we really appreciate you coming on. Gerard Filliti, Senior Counsel for the Lawfare Project. Thank you very much for joining us on TNT this week.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
There he goes, ladies and gentlemen. A lot to think about there. We're still going to revisit this subject in future programs. Let's take a break, however. And when we come back, we're going to connect our next guest. Looking forward to talking to Brian McLean, a.k.a. Hesher, host of State of the Nation. Continue this conversation about Mike Johnson and the Ukraine project. What's happening? We're going to throw more money at Zelensky. Let's talk to Hesher about it in just a minute.